Hey, everybody, this is Brom, and I'm here having a wonderful interview with Monsters, Madness, and Magic. Hope you enjoy the show.
So, Brom, take us back in time. You're a youngster. Are you a book reader, fort builder, troublemaker, or all of the above?
Oh, which one? All of the above, definitely. Yes. I feel very fortunate that I was an army brat, so I got to grow up all over the world. At 3 years of age, we moved to, actually, I was 6 months old. We moved to Japan, and I lived there till I was 3 years old. My family has always been based in the South, so that's been a big influence on me. Lived in Hawaii for 3 years, lived in Germany for 3 years, graduated high school there. Then it's just been wherever my muse has taken me from there.
So, you got to experience a lot of different cultures early on.
I did, and that made a big impact on so much of my worldview, on my artistic view. People asked, what inspires you, and my answer is like everything. Everything. It can be just looking at the colors in the bark of a tree, but obviously your environment. We've moved here to Savannah recently, and these beautiful trees dripping with Spanish moss. It's you'll be seeing that creeping into my work as well.
Awesome. In all your different moves, you moved around a lot. In all the different locations, is there one that maybe you sort of struggled adjusting to the different culture? Maybe one that was a cultural shock, maybe?
I think the biggest cultural shock was when we moved to Hawaii. I was in fifth grade, middle of fifth grade, and first of all, anytime you move in the middle of a school year, it's tough. But that environment was, it was just it wasn't as appreciative of maybe the nerd culture as other places. Some of that culture was well, partly it's where I went to school at. It was very much a rough uh, community, and there was a lot of maybe macho attitudes. A lot of you needed to be tough and badass, and I was neither. So and but uh, I never, it's not like I have any regrets of my experiences there. I feel like anytime, and let me qualify that. The school I went to, I went from a school in the South Alabama, a very small town, to a school that basically had gangs, um, based on your ethnic background, and there were bathrooms that you weren't allowed to go in unless you were in part of that gang. So, that was a huge culture shock to me to go into that environment. Um, but as with all things, your experiences make who you are. And in that particular environment, myself and other artistic and creative people, we tended to huddle in the library because the library was a safe place to be.
Right.
And those I feel are some of my most formative years as far as a creative person, because that's when I really indulged in, reading, whether it was Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter Mars, Conan, Lord of the Rings, Stephen King, all of this stuff, I was discovering there, Monty Python.
Hmm.
I really, with my friends, dove into all of that, and I had so much growth. We all were, almost competitively drawing the things that we were reading and inspired by. Um, so yeah, it was quite an adjustment, but it was overall a very positive experience.
And just in terms of, you said you were a book reader, so you mentioned Edgar Rice Burroughs and Stephen King. What specifically, when you think of growing up, were there any specific stories and authors that you lean towards that ring a bell or jump out to you?
Definitely Tolkien.
Hmm.
The Lord of the Rings were just such a profound influence. The other is Michael Moorcock, Elric. That series, to me, he was the grandfather of modern Gothic fiction. I feel even before Anne Rice with the Vampire Chronicles, I feel he was one of the first people, at least I was aware of, that took this tragic vampiric figure, which was Elric. He had this sword that sucked souls from both his friends and from his enemies, and he was tortured by that. So that really fed into my whole gothic, melodramatic side of my personality and inspired a lot of paintings. And to this day, that's probably one of my favorite fictional characters to draw and paint.
Do you remember your first Elric story, your first exposure to Elric?
I think I just really started at the beginning of the Elric Chronicles.
Hmm.
Actually, I think it was his. I'm going to get this wrong. His other character, is it Cormac? Cormac, possibly the one with an eye patch. Yeah, I'm so bad with names. I read one of those and I just loved that style. And all Michael Moorcock's novels tying together. And once I saw the pale, vampiric Elric figure, I fell in love.
What about artists specifically that inspired you? Like, obviously, Michael Whalen has done some Moorcock. So were those covers the first ones that you gravitated towards as well?
I'm not even sure if Michael Moorcock had those first covers, but he was, as far as artist influences, I mean that list is miles
Yeah.
long. My earliest influences were, again, I mentioned Japan, and when I was 3 years old, before any of anime, before Ultraman or any of that stuff was coming to the United States, I was seeing that as a child. This would have probably been 1968, 69, and actually maybe 67. And those Ultraman and all those monsters, that was amazing. Godzilla. And then from there, uh, what I had access to was my library when we moved back to the States, and for there it was the dinosaur books. Those were my dragons
Hmm.
and scary beast, and I spent a lot of time drawing dinosaurs fighting Ultraman, and it just all fit together. After dinosaurs, I think that's really when fiction really entered the picture. And just I didn't read for quite a while, but once, as typical, reading somehow I associated with schoolwork. I don't want to do that. And somewhere around fourth grade, I read my first John Carter Mars book, and I was like, this is amazing. This is like so transportative. This is I like read that book nonstop, and then I read all of that series. Um, and that was so inspiring. So yeah, I guess it would probably be around fourth, fifth grade that I started getting into literature. And again, it was Edgar Rice Burroughs was probably the first real genre fiction that I read.
You mentioned earlier your father was in the service, I believe it was, and were either of them are your parents artistically inclined at all? Do you think maybe that's where some of it was rooted in?
It's a fascinating thing to analyze. Is where does art come from? How much of it's genetic? How much of it's environmental? My father and his side of the family, there's just zero artistic anything, but there is such a drive on that, an obsessive nature on that side of the family, meaning they set a goal and they achieve it. Nothing can get in their way. On my mother's side is, you have the artists and the musicians. And my mom painted off and on, never professionally, but she was the one that was always very supportive and encouraging. And my father, he just didn't understand it at all. It's kind of funny. When I was going off to art school, I went to a 2-year art school, and this is the vote of confidence my dad left me with. He said that he was a military man, and he said, if this art thing doesn't work out, the Air Force treats an enlisted man good. So he was like, that's how much confidence he thought that there was, the ability to make a decent living, or even a living as an artist. And in fairness, it is a very tough route. And I would be very careful how much I encouraged anybody to pursue art, because it's never been an easy way to make a living. But back to the original question, it was my mother that was supportive and understood and encouraged, and always made sure that I had a good drawing table and some art tools, and so forth.
So, what sort of records were spinning around the house when you were growing up?
So with my parents, it was this was 68, 67, or early late 60s, early 70s, and they're both come from a small town in Alabama. So it was country music. It was Johnny
Mm.
Cash, going, Ring of Fire. I still have vivid memories of spinning around the room, being on fire while listening to Burning Ring of Fire, because that's how I interpreted that song. Um, so yeah, which is interesting because as with most young people, there was a point where I rejected all of that. I hate country music, and then as I got older, I had a real return to, especially early country music, 60s, 70s. Um, and the nostalgic there, it plays into your soul. It's part of what makes you who you are.
Speaking of that, I just think of formative moments in my childhood and try to ask guests about them. And that for me, that is, first movie you saw at theaters. What is that for you?
First movie, I it's not so much the movies I remember as television shows, and the ones that made the biggest impression. Night Gallery was like second grade and stuff. That was the show that came on right at my bedtime. Like, we never got to stay up to see it. Occasionally we did, but it was that forbidden horror, scary fruit. And I remember actually crawling down the hall and peeking around the door to watch it because my parents would be watching it when I was supposed to be in bed. Um, so, Night Gallery, Twilight Zone, all those were, there when I was young. Star Trek, those were some of my biggest influences. Addams Family, and I can't say enough about Saturday morning cartoons. And it's something, every generation there's trade-offs, and there was something wonderful about only having three channels to choose from when you were children, and it was this shared experience. What you saw Planet of the Apes television show. Well, all your friends saw it the next day. You shared it. And Saturday morning was when they had all the exciting cartoons, and it was something you look forward to. You got up in the morning, you watched them, your friends watched them. And so, those shows were also a big influence getting started.
Awesome. Yeah. I don't know if you remember this one specifically. I love the Night Gallery as well, but my favorite episode was all the outlaws, the gunslingers in the tavern, and they were all dead, but they didn't know it. And when the poker game was over,
Yeah.
it turns out they were all hanged. Yeah, I
Oh,
love that
yeah, yeah.
episode.
Yeah, that's beautiful. You've seen that. There were so many clever ideas that you see come forward, and you see them today in other things. But Twilight Zone and Night Gallery were really ground. I mean, Serling was just. Is it Sterling or Serling?
Serling.
Sterling. Thank you.
That's a whole thing. That's a Mandela effect. People talk about it. Was it Sterling? Is it Serling? I
Yeah.
don't know.
But people like him, they're very rare, and he really was such a profound cultural influence on so much of what we love today.
So how early on, Brom, would you say that you began experimenting creatively? Were you drawing on walls and stuff early on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And most you I feel I really feel art is born in a person. It seems to be so universal with anybody that I know that is that their art or their writing or their music is more than just a hobby. They never had to be told to do this or do this in class. They did it. They found it. Or it found them maybe. And my earliest memories were finding paper, getting crayons. My earliest memories are the crayon paper, and I'm drawing monsters, and I'm writing a little story. As soon as I was able to write, and stapler, and it's making these little books, and it was words and pictures, and it's the same thing I'm doing today. I mean, I use a computer now, and I use oil paints and canvases and so forth. But I write my stories, and I draw my characters, and I put it all together. So to answer your question, as early as I can remember, any marking tool I had, I was making little monsters.
This is something I like to ask everyone just because you never know.
Yeah.
What scared you as a kid?
What scared me as a kid? Same thing that scares me now. I'm very superstitious. I think, if you have a vivid imagination, it's easy for it to get away from you. And, any bumps and thumps in dark, confined spaces, and something is about to grab me at any moment. One of the tales I like to tell is my grandmother had an older house, And the basement was a dirt basement, and it was all like stone walls. And they stored a lot of different things down there. And this is a Southern family, so they, had a lot of canned fruit and stuff, fruit and vegetables in jars. And it it was one of the creepiest places I knew. This crooked stairway down into the darkness, and it had one light bulb down there, one of those old pull the strings, click on, click off. And my brother and I would go down there when we were young at night. And the trick, this trick was we would pull the string to turn the light out. And it was who could stand there the longest before turning the light back on. And to this day, I can remember turning it off. I could just visualize the things in the dark getting closer and closer and closer. And I think I'm always the one that turned it back on. But I don't think I could do that today without, or I wouldn't last very long, maybe a minute tops. One of the things I've often heard people talk about with ghosts, they say, if you don't believe in ghosts, you're supposed to, when the house is completely empty, go in the bathroom and look in the mirror all by yourself in there in the dark. And you're supposed to look in the mirror and you're supposed to challenge somebody that's dead. You're supposed to say, I don't believe so-and-so ever lived. And apparently, that person will appear in the mirror. So I've never been able to take that challenge.
Was that like a Bloody Mary type legend that you grew up on or something?
Perhaps it was, but still haven't got the nerve to do that.
Was there ever a point where art became more than a passion for you, and then you realized that you could pursue it as a career, or was it always just passion and it happened to fall that way?
Yeah, it's funny. There's two I don't know if rumors is the right word. Two myths out there. One myth is, artists make a ton of money, and then there's the starving artist, and it's the artists that make a lot of money at art are a very, very small percentage, and the rest of us, it's a struggle. But when I was younger, I don't even think I thought. You always think somebody else is born to be the things you want. Like people are born artists and they're just ordained to be art, and they're handed brushes and money and they do this thing. I think younger, I didn't even think it was a possibility. It was something I did because I loved it, because it was something I did with friends. It was a way, to have things to share with people. And I think near in high school, we had some colleges come in and sell us on the whole thing. So I started putting my head around, like, how do I make this real? Can I make this real? And I went to a 2-year commercial arts school. And, sadly, that school didn't teach drawing or painting, but it did teach all the other aspects of being a graphic designer, or being trying to make a living in the creative arts. And I think I've gone off on a tangent here, but at that point, that was when I realized that that it was a challenging path. It wasn't somebody was going to just pluck you out of the ether and ordain you as an artist. That it was something you had to work hard at.
If you had to pinpoint, if someone asked you, what do you consider your entry point, quote unquote, big break moment to be into the art realm, what is it?
As with so many people, it's often a long process, a lot of little stages. But I did have a real break moment. When I left art school, it was the around 86, 85 maybe. And airbrush was the commercial look. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was not able to do genre work at that time. I didn't even, again, that whole self-doubt thing, not only was it hard enough for me to think, can I be an artist and make a living at art, but oh my gosh, of course I can't be a fantasy artist or a dark horror artist, this thing I really love. So I entered into the art world through commercial art, doing commercial product renderings, Coca-Cola. This is before the computer, so it was all done by hand. It was done by airbrush, very slick type of look at the time. I remember at first, I was just so excited and thrilled that I was actually making a living doing artwork, even if it was so soul-killing. But it wasn't at first. It was very exciting. But after about 3 years of that, it was, it got very frustrating because I had all these monsters and very creative characters that I wanted to get out of me. And I started on my non-existent free time putting together a portfolio of the art I loved, back to my roots, back to my monsters, and back to my fantastical creatures and characters, and started shopping it around. And there's actually a fairly funny story here. So I was going around and at the conventions, and I was getting a bit of work, some comic covers, and my first comic covers were first comics. It was for this one, I think was Nexus, and some was some Twilight Man. These things paid nothing. They paid like $80. I was just so excited and thrilled. It's like my whole passion of art came back to me. But how do I make a living at this? I can't live off these covers. And I ran into the art director for Dragon Magazine, who worked at TSR. And my portfolio is really weak at that time, I have to admit. I didn't think so because I was young and full of snot and thought I was, really had something to contribute here. But he was really nice and very encouraging. And he gave me, he passed the buck. He gave me the phone number of the art director at TSR. I know he was thinking, I'll let her deal with this guy. And I sent her her name's Peggy Cooper. I sent her my portfolio and didn't hear anything. But again, like I said, I was young and just really full of myself. So I called up and I said, what do you think of this work I sent you? And she was very nice. She sort of hee-hawed around and said, well, we don't really have anything for you right now. But during the conversation, she let it slip that they were looking for an artist, a staff artist, that two of our artists had just left and they were looking for somebody to fill the spot. And I'm like, me, of course. No, that's for me. And she laughed, and I invited myself up. This was Wisconsin. I was in Atlanta. And I said, I invited myself for him. She was so sweet. She didn't say no. She said that we don't want you. We're not interested. She's like, well, okay, you can come by, So I get on a plane and I fly up there, and I'm introduced to the artist and the art director there. And everybody's very encouraging and kind. But at the end of the interview, the art director, or the day, I spent the day with them, and they took me out to lunch. Great folks, Jeff Easley, Clyde Caldwell. I think Fred Fields was working there at the time. And the art director, he pulled me aside at the end of the day. He said, look, kid, appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have 11 people that we're considering for this job, that we're interviewing for job. And of that 11, you're number 11 on the list. So it's like, oh, that was a gut punch.
Yeah.
So I think I was 23, 24 years of age. So I went back to Atlanta, tail tucked between my legs. But again, when you're young, you take it and you go, I was talking earlier about my father and his, whatever he set a goal on, he didn't let anything stop him. So I continued. My wife and I went to, back then, the only places to get genre work, where it was games, comics, and book covers. And at the book covers was probably the most prestigious place to do art. It's where, the most well-known artists were doing work. So I'm like, I have to break into this one way or the other. We had very little money, but we went up and got an apartment there and came back to Atlanta and packed up the house. We were going to move, and it was going to be make or break. If this didn't work, I would just have to move back, into my parents' basement or something, because it's going to take every penny we had to do this. We packed up the U-Haul. We had everything packed but the phone. It says no exaggeration, whatever. The phone is sitting on the wood floor. I just have this so vivid, this memory. I was about to call my parents and tell them we're driving up to New Jersey. And the phone rings, and I think it's my mom. I pick it up, and it's the art director from TSR. And he said, he says, are you still interested in that job by chance? And I'm like, huh? Well, yeah, of course I am. And he goes, well, apparently the other 10 artists that we were interviewing didn't want us move to a little tiny town in Wisconsin. So if you're still up for it, you can have this job. And I'm like, oh my God, yes, I'll take it. I'll work for free. I'll wash dishes. I'll do whatever it takes, And he goes, great. But, I know that it's probably, going to take you a while to get up here. You got to get out of your lease. You probably have to finish up work. How many months will it take you to get up here? And so I look out the door at the U-Haul that's fully packed, and I'm like, I can be there in 8 hours. and I was. So back to the original question, that was probably my biggest break. That was, again, with the commercial art, I was slowly building this career, slowly getting better at this thing, going in a direction I didn't really want to go. But in the course of basically one phone call, I went from being a struggling commercial artist, hoping to break into the fantasy art field, to suddenly working full time as a fantasy artist at a premier game company.
Wow, and that's why you shoot the shot. That's why you take the chance. It's funny because just yesterday, and the way I'm going to release these, this will come afterwards, so it's going to make sense to folks that'll be listening.
Okay.
Just hearing you, and I was interviewing Todd McFarlane yesterday, and when most people think art, there's usually like this flowery, passionate view of it. But in order to make it, you mentioned your father's work ethic and how he sort of has the military background. Todd said the same thing, but it was sports and his competitive nature and his father's competitive nature. So it's kind of like it's a perfect blend of blue collar work ethic with the passion. It's just cool to see that you have to have that nose to the grindstone mentality.
You do. And it's, I mean, there are exceptions to everything, but I know so many incredibly talented people that seem to lack that drive, that determination, that they let small things keep them from their goals. And to have that combination of a work ethic, well, I think most artists have a strong work ethic, but a business head combined with a creative head. I often consider, it's almost two skill sets. The business part of me has to make the bubble that the creative part of me can work in, and it's not always easy.
Just to use like a musician analogy, there's multiple ways to skin a cat. Maybe a song starts with a riff, melody, lyrics, or what have you. How does that work for you as an artist? Is there a concrete method you follow, or is it different each time?
I like to say I just wait around for my muse. That would be nice, but I'd be waiting around a long, long time. I think it's one of the things also that my commercial years really helped me out with. The 3, maybe it was 4 years I worked commercially, is the deadlines were tight. Things would turn around in 2 or 3 days, and you didn't have the luxury of waiting to be inspired. You had to make yourself, be creative. You had to just be able to work through it, whatever was going on, whatever distractions. And so for me, it's several different approaches. There are those wonderful moments where, I just wake up in the morning. It's like, oh man, do I have an idea? And I'm trying to scribble it down, whether it's for writing or for art. But there's also, this sounds odd, I love a box. And by that meaning, when I do fine art, pure fine art for myself, sometimes I am just overwhelmed by the affinity of everything. Like I can do anything. There's no box. And one of the things I do like about illustration, as opposed to fine art, is there's a clear-cut thing I'm trying to do. And I find that very conducive to being creative. If I am doing an Elric cover, and it's Elric, dealing with his sword, it's like already the ideas are just flowing because I can see him clutching his sword. So I'm going off on tangents here, but that's one way that I'm inspired, is by giving an idea, and then I'm allowed to build on that idea. Maybe that's a good way to say it. The fine art way is more when I'm just struck with inspiration and there's just something I want to illustrate. And that inspiration can come from anything, as I was saying earlier. It can just come from looking at the bark in a tree and just seeing colors and forms, and an idea, or a walk through a museum, just through a graveyard, you name it, you get this inspiration. Some ideas come fully blown. Some ideas evolve as you're working on them. And I really like that. I think that's a very natural process. I try to leave, like when I'm painting, I try to leave room in the painting to discover things for the painting to go in different directions. And that's part of where the difference in fine art and illustration can everything's trade-off. That's where illustration can be very frustrating for me, is like if I'm moving into illustration and I'm inspired to go in a direction, but it doesn't fit what the illustration needs to be, that can be creatively limited. Where with fine art, it's like, suddenly you get an idea to have fire coming out of somebody's ears and you just go with it. So yeah, I think there's multiple places where inspiration comes from.
Right. And with the box that you're talking about, and just to stick on Elric, take Michael Whalen's covers, for example. When you're working on a character that's established with previous artists and stuff, how do you toe the line between staying true to the character design and putting your own stamp on things?
Yeah, and first of all, if I didn't clarify earlier, Michael Whalen's first Elric paintings, those were probably the ones I was most inspired by. Those are the quintessential ones to me because those were the ones I saw in my formative years with Elric. It's just kind of like Frazetta with Conan or Junkheart of Mars. That will forever be how that character looks like to me, which makes, to your point, it when you feel in your mind's eye that's what the character looks like, it is hard to take it in a different direction. I think by nature we tend to build on what we already see. I've done a couple paintings of Conan, and every time I feel like to some degree it is an homage to Frazetta. There is, that face in my Conan and never to the level that he achieves, but it is underneath what I'm painting. And I could say the same about Elric. There is a certain bit of Whalen in every Elric I do. Yeah, and I think it attests to a bigger question. Whenever, where inspiration comes for any art that you do, as far as the style of it and where your inspirations come from. And what I always tell people that's important, it's when I do a painting, I usually have a variety of images out, whether it's photography or other artists and stuff, but I feel it's important to be inspired by many sources. When you're only looking at one creative person, one artist, their vision is going to be too heavy in what you do. It finds that's a fine line between being inspired by and just ripping somebody off. But if you can have many artists that you're inspired by, then hopefully it goes through your personal filter, and what comes out, is unique to you. You are adding to the conversation. Your Elric, for example, hopefully has enough of your own personal stamp on it. Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's fair to to acknowledge and an homage to the people that inspired you.
The opportunity for Elric came to you to work on. How did that go about?
Oh, the first Elric one.
Yeah.
I worked at TSR for Dungeons and Dragons for 4 years, and I left there. I loved working there. It's incredible experience, but at that point, I wanted to move on and do book covers and do my own personal projects. So when I left there and I started freelancing, it was White Wolf Publishing. They contacted me. They were doing an Elric anthology, and fortunately, my aesthetic lined up with theirs, and they thought I was the perfect person for them. And I have to say that was, you talk about defining moments of your career. That was such an amazing thing to me. And I was probably, I don't know, 27-ish when I got that job, maybe 28. And it was this amazing, like, reconnecting with my younger self. It was almost like I wanted to hug my younger self, like, or maybe my younger self wanted to hug me. Can you believe that you're actually, painting an official cover for this character and this author that brought so much to who you are artistically? So yeah, that was definitely a career defining moment for me.
I don't know if you know him personally, but I spoke with Kevin Schilder. He was the composer and sound designer for Raven Software during the Heretic
Oh,
days. And I know that you did some early work on those games. Was that just, they hired you to do it, or did you know those guys?
yeah. So that was another wonderful, anytime you do commercial art, and sometimes it can, let me back up. Oftentimes you end up working with the marketing team that you don't know, and they're sometimes not even personally attached to the product on a geek level, perhaps like a lot of creatives are. But with Raven Software, this was when I just left TSR. So I was in Wisconsin. They were up in Madison, Wisconsin. And Steve Raffel, he was a big fan of mine, and he contacted me, and we built, a wonderful personal relationship. And it was very creatively satisfying too, because I didn't feel like I was just being hired for a job. It was very collaborative. We were working together. They created these characters, and then I got to paint the characters. And I have to add, in those days, my role as an illustrator for video games was very different. Back then, the resolution was so low on the creatures they created that it was kind of my role to bring them to life, to bring them into focus, into high detail, and that was a challenge maybe. So that was very exciting to me. And going off on a slight tangent here, now when I do work for computer games like Blizzard or Diablo, the in-game resolution and the cinematics are just so mind-blowing. It's almost like I'm doing the opposite. I'm bringing this sort of retro, classical feel of traditional materials to the whatever project I'm doing. But before I go too far, it was, working with Raven was wonderful. Those guys were, most of these game companies, especially then, they're just a group of artists and game creators coming out of their garages and basements. And everybody there was, were into this on some creative level.
Since you mentioned Frazetta earlier, I wanted to ask you, like, what was your chicken and egg situation? Was it Frazetta that led you to Howard, or did Howard lead you to Frazetta?
It was Frazetta led me to Howard. My brother is 3 years older than me. He had the Conan books with the Frazetta covers. And I think it was actually one of Edgar Rice Burroughs' books that I first saw. And I couldn't have been more than 4, maybe 5 years old. And it was just, it was everything. It was, even at that age, it was like, this speaks to me on such a high level. I was doing little Frazetta copies at 5 years old, 6 years old. So,
have you ever considered writing fiction in long form style?
Oh, well, yeah. So I think I'm working on what am I up to? My 5th novel now. So,
I'm out of the loop, man. I got to catch up.
Funny that you should ask that. And what is also funny about this, I think in my early 30s, and this would be a long story to tell here, but got into illustration, commercial art. Then I finally got into genre artwork and working at TSR. And there was a point there where, after I had done work for TSR and had done a few personal project card games, if I had a lot of freedom, I was back out in the freelance market. And I felt like a lot of the work that was coming to me was repetitive. People wanted me to paint pretty much the same painting I'd painted before. And I was very creative, frustrated. And as I'd mentioned earlier, as a kid, I was always writing stories to go along with my art. And so I was becoming burnt out on illustration. I wasn't, again, I found myself in a spot where I wasn't able to move forward. I had these ideas. And I figured the only way I could do that is to create my own fiction to illustrate. And so I went back to my original love of writing. The first 2 novels I wrote, they're illustrated novels, The Plucker and The Devil's Rose. They were highly illustrated. There was a painting for every page of prose, because I was learning to write, and I was relying on my illustration skills to hold a lot of the story up. The visual language was in the illustrations. But right around after I finished the second one, the writer in me, was actually becoming competitive with the illustrator in me, and wanted to prove that I could do a novel that would stand on prose alone. And my first book was The Child Thief, which was a dark retelling of the Peter Pan myth. And it was really telling the story of what it would be like to be essentially kidnapped by Peter Pan and brought to an island and taught to kill and murder human beings, which was a fantastic playground to play in. That one, I did have illustrations dotted through it, but it was a full, 400-page novel.
Right.
And since then, I've written a couple more. Slewfoot, which is the playing on the Krampus. Sorry, not Slewfoot. Krampus the Yule Lord, which is playing on the Krampus mythology. And then the Lost Gods, which is a trek through purgatory. And the last one I just finished up was Slewfoot, which is I've always been fascinated with the Salem witch trials, but anytime I hear anything about the Salem witch trials, I'm just like, oh, wouldn't it be incredible if the people they were trying as witches were actually witches, and there would be hell to pay, and that was, pretty much the jumping off point for Slewfoot.
Man, I feel terrible now. I'm gonna have to read all of these. I had no
Well, you
idea.
just go back and edit your question. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so, yeah, take a look. To me, part of the joy of it is it's all one vision. I've always enjoyed illustrated novels. We have such a great tradition of that, back to N.C. Wyeth and all the classic American illustrators illustrating classic literature. And to be able to write a story and then illustrate the characters, to me, is the ultimate self-expression for me, because I have control of everything. Whenever I start doing collaborative work, I enjoy that as well, but it's not completely my vision. And what I'm leading up to, I mentioned a little earlier, there's a bit of competitiveness between the illustrator in me and the writer in me, and at times it really does feel like two creatives working together collaboratively, and it usually does feel collaborative, because usually I originally used to start with the illustrations idea and work the story around it, but now I usually start with a writing idea, and I'll start working the writing, the characters, and then I'll draw the characters on the side, and the stuff that I'm inspired by in my own prose to illustrate, I will discover stuff in the illustrations that then go back into the prose, and it goes back and forth, so the two feed on each other, which is very. It's also, the other thing it does for me is, as I mentioned, how I got burnt out on illustration in my early 30s. It keeps it fresh. I find creativity in general, whenever you start feeling like you're getting a little frustrated, try new things, whether it's just painting huge or painting small, using a different media. So for me to be able to, jump from writing, and when that starts getting to be, a little burnt out, I go to the painting, and it's been very key to keeping my creativity fresh over the years.
So when you're writing, do you just sit down and go with the flow? Do you outline, or do you consider your painting to be the outline?
So my earlier books, like The Plucker, which was essentially the mythology of childhood mixed together. It was two mythologies. It was one, the way that toys come to life in the world and make believe, but it was also the fact that there's monsters under a bed. So these two things clash. That one was me doing drawings of twisted toys and childhood monsters, and working a story around what I wanted to illustrate. But as I've matured as a writer, the themes and ideas that excite me, because I know they have potential to break new ground, at least for me, as to how the story is told, tend to be, the idea itself for the story, which in its turn, was my original inspiration to be an illustrator, was reading literature. So now it starts with a story, moves into the illustrations, and it goes back and forth.
Brom, out of all the work that you've been commissioned to work on, someone that's approached you, what would you consider the most challenging? Is there one you lost sleep over?
The most challenging. So I'd have to divide it in two different things. I'd have to divide it into my commercial art world and then my genre art illustration. So in my commercial art days, it's the project that broke me. And the project that broke me was in the early 80s, middle 80s there. The California raisins were big. And so everybody wanted their product painted with cute little arms and legs. And this company came to me. They did art core, which is a type of foam core, pure white board that you can mount art on. And they wanted art core man, which is essentially this white board with arms and legs and a face and sunglasses for some reason, because he was really cool, right? Art core man was cool. He had sunglasses. So I paint art core man. And again, this is before computers, if you can imagine. So I paint. It's a white board, and white is either cool or warm depending on what color's around it. So the first time I did it was cool, and it was like, oh, the color's too blue. It's just too cool. And it's like, okay, so I went and repainted it with a warmer white. And because there were no computers, I mean, this is something that would take 2 seconds today. You would take it in there and you would just warm up the white, or you would cool down the white. I had to repaint the thing. So about the 4th time I repainted this thing, because they couldn't figure out what shade of white they wanted. I remember I crawled into my art closet, shut the door, turned the light on, and there in my art closet were my old drawings from my monster drawings and stuff. And not to be too over dramatic here, but it was like there were tears in my eyes. It's like, God, well, I want to go back to doing this stuff. So in my commercial days, Artcore Man broke me. But in my genre illustration days, the most frustrating ones was, as I touched on earlier, was when I had to deal with marketing. Because when I deal with creatives, it feels collaborative. When I get into marketing, and not all marketing, but most marketing situations, and it seems like the more money you're being paid, the more shit you have to deal with. And there would be samples where I would do, normally the process is you would do 5 or 6 thumbnail sketches, rough drawings to sort of work out the idea, and you would run this by the art directors and to come up with an idea. So I would send in these 6 or 7, and it's like they couldn't figure out what they wanted. It's just like, and I felt good about most of the sketches. These could all be good paintings, but they couldn't figure it out because, for one reason, they went to school for marketing. They weren't really genre people. So they would take these drawings and go to the mall, and they would run them by 12-year-olds, and they would say, out of these 6, which do you like better? Well, 12-year-olds will always pick the one with all their arms and legs and swords out. Whatever the one that looks like the guy's jumping for some weird reason, the most dynamic, comic booky looking concept is what they're going to go to, which would usually be fine, but that there, often there would be pieces that I knew were better. Anyway, the long and short of it, by the time it went through the marketing process, the painting I had to do was stupid. All right. There's no other way around it. It's just like, I don't want to paint this stupid. You guys managed to come up with the most common denominator composition you can possibly come up with. So I can't really maybe name up a specific one, but there were a handful of computer covers there at that point that were challenging because of the marketing people I had to deal with.
And I'm not an artist myself, Brom, but just to ask, if how would you teach yourself? How did you teach yourself to draw some of those classic characters? Like, how do you draw Conan? Is that a question you can answer?
No, it's a good question. And everybody has their different paths to what their the way their style, or how they paint and illustrate. For me, when I was young, it was, I was often living in small towns or in isolated communities, and I just emulated the work I liked. When I was in Japan, I tried to do Ultraman and then dinosaurs and so forth. So I would look at art I liked and I would try to emulate it. And that's how I learned, by doing a lot of really bad drawings and paintings. And with each one, you learn from your mistakes. It's like, okay, that didn't work, don't do that again. So for the most part, I'm self-taught. One of my frustrations when I did go to 2-year commercial school is they didn't have drawing and painting. And I will also add to this that this was the middle of the 80s, and classic illustration, you couldn't find it. It wasn't being taught then. The colleges were teaching, abstract art. They were telling you to stay away from illustration, that it was bad and evil. And then the commercial art schools, for the most part, at least that I ever had access to, did not have that level of talent there. So for most of my life, it was, being self-taught. It was looking at art I liked and emulating it. My big break again was when I got hired on at TSR. I went from total isolation to suddenly being in the room with, 3 or 4 professional artists. Again, Clyde Caldwell, Jeff Easley, Fred Fields, and Rob Ruppel joined us. All very, very talented people. And to suddenly have that wealth of professionalism around you to learn from, and even just the most basic things, what kind of board to use, how to gesso a board, what's the best paints and brushes. That probably was, my biggest school there. And it wasn't just learning from them, but it was also sharing what we knew. Rob Ruppel was such an academic, and he was so well read, and he was like always talking to us about color theory and planes of the face. And so that was an incredible time of growth. It felt like every painting I was getting better with that much influence around me.
Like when I think to the 90s, one of the films that pops in my head when I think Halloween aesthetic is Sleepy Hollow. I know you did the poster for that. So how did that come about for you?
I have no idea how they do posters these days, but at that time, it was pretty much a nightmare. Tim Burton or somebody reached out to, okay, let me back up. How it works then is Tim Burton doesn't sit down and say, let's do a poster together. It's licensed out to a marketing team, and the marketing company, that's all they do is movie posters. But they called me. I was probably in Pittsburgh at the time, I think in LA, and they said, hey, we think your look is what we need for this film. And I'm so flattered. I'm thrilled. I was like, oh my God, they've come to me to do the cover for this. I'm a huge Tim Burton fan. This is great. They fly me out there. I've got all these ideas sketched up already, and I want to share them with them. And before they go, wait, I want you to look at this first. And they bring out a stack, and with no exaggeration, there had to be at least 200 pages in this stack. They set it down. And these were all concepts that they had been working on for this poster. And I'm flipping through them, and they're cool. They're good. I mean, they're kind of photographically montaged. I forgot when that movie came out. It might have been the late 80s, early 90s. They were part of the look at that time. But they were beautiful, lots of awesome compositions. And as I'm looking through this, I'm kind of deflating. I'm like, oh, this is really good. And I say, if you don't like this, what are you looking for? And there's like, well, and this is interesting, the politics of movies between the producers, the director, and the movie studio, they can't agree on what they want. And I'm like, oh no. So I get to try to figure out what these three folks want. Oh, that's going to go over well. So they said, well, what they're really thinking is they need a painterly look. And so they commissioned me to do 3 paintings. And of the 3, I feel they picked the worst one. That's always the way that goes. And then I was still excited. It's like, this is so neat. I get to be collaborative part of this process. And then when the poster comes out, this is the earliest days of Photoshop. They'd taken my image of the horseman, and they had shrunk it way down, and they'd photo chomped it with a tree and this moon. And it was just so anticlimactic for me. But there's my tale of my movie poster experience.
Did they let you watch the movie to get a feel for it or anything like that? Or was it just do the picture for the poster?
No, they did have some photo stills. They had a lot of photo stills, and I think I might have been able to read through the script. But they were very concise on what they wanted. They wanted just the horseman in different poses on the horse. And, we did dozens of drawings before we did the 3 paintings. And,
so you kind of touched on this a few minutes ago, but in your art career, what would you say is the best advice that was given to you, and who gave it to you? When
my dad told me to go into the military as an enlisted man, I should have listened to him. Life would have been so much easier. No. I feel very fortunate. This art has been very good to me. It's just a blessing to be able to make a living at what you love. So I'm very thrilled about that. But as far as advice, so much advice. Don't eat lead-based paint. That's
a good one.
First one we should all talk about. Stay away from your cadmiums. Once you get past that, this sounds kind of obvious and like an inspirational poster, but what you put in your portfolio is going to be the type of work you get. So be sure to, be honest with yourself with the type of work you put in your portfolio. That's very simple advice. Believe in your vision. Like I said, I spent the first 4 years of my life doing commercial art because I didn't feel that, I could do dark fantasy. What would be my other advice is, try to talk with other professionals, go to conventions and talk to people that are in business, and just, people. One thing I've always loved about the illustration community is just incredibly giving and supportive. And I've never had a bad experience with other illustrators in that capacity. People always seem to be very free with their advice. Maybe one other thing for people to consider if you're young and you're breaking into the business, the whole scam of art schools, and I will say that not all art schools, but most art schools, they sell you a lot and they don't give you a lot. Think about taking that time and money and finding some of these mentorship type programs that have professionals that work in the field that basically they're I'm trying to find the right word, not art camps, but they're like 2 week long or week long art schools. I think that's an amazing, I think you can learn more in 2 weeks or even a week with, established pros than you can 2 years at an art college. I think that's a really good way if you're trying to break into the world of illustration. Now, if you're looking to teach or go into graphic design or some of these others, the rules might be completely different. But when it comes to learning traditional and even digital art skills, learning from the top pros is incredible experience.
Well said. And I just got a couple more here for you, Brom, and I'll let
Yeah,
you go,
sure.
I promise.
It's nice having somebody to hang out with.
So this is another question I like to ask everyone. Sometimes people have a 30-minute answer, sometimes 5 seconds. So have you ever had an experience you would consider supernatural or paranormal?
I'm gonna disappoint you so badly on this because I haven't. I just nothing, and I don't know if I want one or not. I mentioned earlier I'm very superstitious, and just the idea of there being ghosts around, just feels like such an invasion of privacy. And, it's like anytime you do anything weird, is somebody watching you? So if I ever found out that there were ghosts lingering around, that would, might make me a very self-conscious person. That's a funny way to be afraid of ghosts, that they'll make you more self-conscious. But on top of that, yeah, if something ever jumped out at me and went boo, I think I already scream when I get startled. So I just think my nerves would be on edge. So I have not had any supernatural experience, and I'm just fine with that. Maybe that's my answer.
Awesome. Well, Brom, just to put a bow on everything here, just tell folks what you got on the horizon and where they can find you.
Great. You can find me. I don't know if anybody goes to websites anymore, but I actually keep mine fairly up to date. And you just type Brom into Google. It's the first thing that pops up. It's bromart.com. On Facebook and Instagram as well. And I do try to update those when stuff happens. As far as what's going on, I am wrapping up my latest novel, and I can't disclose anything about it at this point, but it is going to be another a full novel with illustrations. After that, I'm hoping to take a little break from the writing and put together a new art book.
Awesome. Ron, I'm going to read your books before we talk again, so I'll have that to talk about next time.
On that note, I'm actually, what's interesting to me since I started writing, illustrating, you shouldn't feel bad at all, because people seem to write to me and they're either like, oh, you also do illustrations. So they know me as a writer, and then they're like impressed that you also do illustrations. Or people come to me and they go, you also write books. And I would say that happens most of the time. So don't feel bad about that.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks for reaching out. It's I mean, how hard is it to talk about yourself for an hour? Like
Right.
there's worse things to do,
Exactly.
right?
And I'm gonna talk to my friend Angelique, and I'll email you about her ghost tours. I'll let you know where they
Yeah,
are.
that would be wonderful. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for indulging me. This has been a lot of fun.